Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you for your ongoing support of the Council Town Hall through your contributions by becoming members and by renewing your memberships. The need for our nonpartisan, informed discussions is more critical than ever. Please consider visiting our website at lawac.org to see how you can support us so that we can continue to bring you quality programming just like today. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's program, The Institutional and Global Origins of Inequality on the African Continent, discussing the health and economic inequities that many African nations face. Today's panelists will include Ambassador Arikana Chihombori Quao, who is an MD and former ambassador of the African Union. We have Ben Murray Bruce, founder of the Silverbird Group and former Nigerian Senator. Grant Harris, CEO of Harris Africa Partners, also a former White House Senior Director for Africa. And today's program will be moderated by Stephen Cheung, President and CEO of the World Trade Center, Los Angeles. For those of you who are joining us online, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. We'll do our very best to get to as many of your questions as possible. Stephen, I think this is our 10th partnered program. I can't wait to hear all of your great questions. Thank you so much for moderating, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for putting on this very important conversation. I think many of you are aware over the last few weeks, the United States has been dealing and grappling with some very difficult issues across this nation. I think we're coming to terms with the social injustice, social inequity, and systemic racial discrimination against certain populations of African American and also the Black community, as well as people of color around the United States. And this is nothing new. I think what's been happening is COVID-19 has exposed some of the systemic challenges, and now the United States and as a nation, we're coming to terms with it. And I think in Los Angeles in particular, we've been dealing with these issues over and over again, and now it's coming to a boiling point. In 1965, during the Watts riots, it was because of the rest of Marquette Frye and the community that felt the inequitable justice and inequitable treatment of their community members. In 1992, during the LA riots, due to Rodney King and Latasha Harlan, all these different issues are happening in Los Angeles. It's a microcosm of what's happening around the world. I think in Los Angeles, as one of the most diverse locations around the world, with over 224 different languages spoken right here. Some of the largest diasporas from around the world are located right here in Los Angeles. We understand the challenges that are happening around the world. And I think we're able to understand that this issue is not just being faced here in Los Angeles, but it's actually being felt across the United States and across the world as well. And that's why I'm delighted today to be joined by distinguished guests and experts that can help shed some light in terms of what's happening here in this region, but also more importantly, how this is actually related to more of a legacy colonialism and some of the issues that are spread throughout the world, specifically against the African continents and African nations. And we would like to hear a bit more about what is happening right now in Africa, how the world and how the African continent is dealing with some of these issues that are surfacing, whether it's COVID-19 related, that's related to the systemic injustice that's been happening around the world. And today we are delighted and honored to be joined by a few key individuals. I think we're dealing with some technical issues, but we're now joined by Ambassador Arikana Chihombori Quao, the former representative to the African Union Mission in Washington, D.C. We're also joined by Mr. Ben Murray Bruce, former Senator of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and also Mr. Grant Harris, CEO of Harris African Partners, and also former Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for African Affairs at the White House. Welcome to all our guests. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Murray Bruce, and thank you, Mr. Harris, for joining us for this very important conversation. Our audience member already have access to your bio, so I'm not going to go too much in detail over your distinguished background and your very impressive work. And because we don't have a lot of time on our calendar today, and we want to make sure that we spend some time with the audience member with their questions, I'm going to jump right into our thoughts and our conversation. I think on top of everybody's minds right now is basically right now, what is happening around the world when it comes to COVID-19 and how that's impacting our community. Here in the United States, as many of you know, we have over 2.39 million confirmed cases with over 123,000 confirmed deaths related to COVID-19. And Los Angeles, unfortunately, is one of the largest areas that are hit by this COVID-19 crisis, with over 78,000 confirmed cases and 3,000 deaths. And what we're finding, especially with our CDC releasing some information, is that the impact to our communities of color are more severe than to the general population. And this is related to a number of different systemic issues that are happening within the microcosm of Los Angeles, whether it's racial residential segregation, whether it's health disparities that are caused by the systemic issue. We see that. But what we want to find out more today is what is happening in Africa. Is that the same situation that's been happening as well? So Ambassador, if we can ask you to provide some insights in terms of currently, what is the impact of the pandemic on the African continents, and how are the various nations in Africa handling this COVID-19 crisis? Ambassador?
I have to say, we actually have been quite lucky. The numbers in Africa haven't quite reached pandemic levels yet. I think so far we are looking at about 90,000 infected, and looking at about maybe 2,500 deaths. The bulk of that is in South Africa, Algeria, and Egypt. I think a lot of it has to do with, people may not realize it, but I think Ebola sort of put us at slightly better preparedness. When the issue of border control came in, the leaders were already prepared. We already had all the measures that we needed at the borders. The health officers were ready at the borders, no-touch thermometers, and also isolation procedures were already in place. And so in terms of containment, I think Africa was prepared, and I can credit that to what we had to do because of Ebola. Even prior to COVID, they were taking temperatures at the airports. I just know it was standard routine since Ebola. So as far as protecting the borders and preventing infections from outside, the African leaders, I have to say, they did a very good job. Particularly that 100% of the cases in Africa, they were actually transported, majority from Europe. And pretty much every country could trace the first case from somebody who had traveled to Europe. So because of that, I think we were able to contain the disease. That's not to say we're out of the woods yet. We are pretty clear that if we should get to pandemic levels, particularly in some of the high density areas, it's going to be as devastating as what we are seeing now in Brazil. Our hope is that we don't get to that. But the aggressiveness with which I have seen the governments approach this situation is quite impressive. We're now having, even when you look at the social distancing, which is really very difficult for the average African community. Of course, the more affluent communities, they can socially distance. But try taking a woman who is living in a household with 10 people and in a two-room house, and how do you tell them to socially isolate? It's not practical. But not only that, also realizing that the Africans in particular environments, they have to work every day for today's meal. So then to tell them that you're quarantined is equivalent to a death sentence. So some preventive and containment measures that are applicable to the developed world, we have to realize that they are not applicable to a lot of the African circumstances, and that's about over 60% of the population. So we're looking at a situation where the governments are having to be very creative and think outside the box. We are seeing now a lot of seamstresses, tailors, factories that were manufacturing clothes, beddings. They've been asked to stop and start manufacturing COVID supplies, and that actually is working quite well. Where we are seeing local people manufacturing face masks, and so the government having to step up and pay these local women to manufacture face masks to make sure that the first level of defense, if we can protect this woman with her 10 family members and make sure that each one of them has a face mask, that will go a long way in prevention. So in terms of education, it's been easy to educate people about COVID and its consequences because of the experience that we had with the Ebola. So Ebola has been a big plus, but in terms of preparedness for should we get into testing and treatment and follow-up of contacts, that remains a challenge because that is calling for serious resources that are needed. And should we get to where we need to do that at a very large scale, Africa is not ready at all, and that's the honest goodness truth. I was looking at a report about less than a month ago. There were 10 countries in Africa that didn't even have a single ventilator.
Wow.
So you're talking some serious situations.
Yeah.
And we are still nowhere near being prepared. The average African country does not even have enough, is not well equipped to treat average day-to-day ailment, let alone pandemic situations. And I can honestly say, if we ever get to pandemic situations in Africa, it's going to be catastrophic. There's no two ways about it. The heads of states are doing the best they can, but we're nowhere near. The healthcare situation in Africa, in most parts of Africa, particularly the government institutions, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I'm hoping that the funding that's going to Africa when it comes to the COVID, that is going to be properly utilized, and that when we emerge from COVID-19, we can emerge with an Africa with a more prepared healthcare system. But I have to say, I've also seen lots of innovations coming out of Africa. We now have lots of young people who are now, they've invented how to manufacture our own testing kits from all the way from Tunisia, West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. We've got young inventors who are just springing up all over. We're now having young people who have invented ventilators. So we have some countries that are now manufacturing ventilators. So it's causing Africans to stop and begin to look inward. More importantly, we're so used to just importing everything. COVID-19 is making Africans stop because China was now refusing to ship anything to Africa because they needed it for themselves. And so Africa is forced to look from within, and voila, they're realizing we can do this. We can do this. So I think while it is a difficult situation, but I think it's going to be an opportunity for Africa to stop and realize that you have a continent of 1.3 billion people. You have everything you need. So start looking from inside. So for now, we keep our fingers crossed. We hope that the numbers will not continue to grow.
That's wonderful to hear in terms of the innovation and the adaptiveness of the African continent in terms of looking at that. I think in the United States, we're also starting to face that as well in terms of our supply chain, so dependent on China previously, and now we have to look inwards. And thank you for providing that insight in terms of the African continent. On the more micro level, even though it's still a pretty large area, I am curious to find out more, Senator Mary Bruce, on your take in terms of what's happening, for example, what's happening in Nigeria. Can you share a bit more from that level, country level, how COVID-19 and also some of the issues that the ambassador was mentioning, whether that's affecting you the same way?
Well, thank you very much. And the ambassador is right. The biggest problem we have is not enough money is allocated from the budget to healthcare, just like education across Africa. And this is the biggest problem. And you can argue that they don't have enough money in the first place, so they can allocate a big amount of money for healthcare. But let me tell you the beauty of it. For the first time, rich people are dying. When rich people die, leaders pay attention to healthcare. If rich people were not dying, this disease does not have any respect for wealth or poverty. So it's a blessing. When rich people die, all of a sudden, African countries are not going to spend a large amount of money on healthcare. So this is important. Precautions have been taken. If we have a pandemic, we could lose half our population in the whole continent. And it's true. This is serious business. So the Nigerian government is doing the best they can, especially the Lagos State government doing an amazing job trying to contain the problem. This is new to everybody. It's never been seen before. The biggest problem we have is to the economy. How Africa can recover from what is happening I don't even know where to begin. First of all, we had high unemployment. Now you throw thousands. In my company alone, we fired 50% of our workforce. Now you fire 50% of your workforce, and what happens to them? The economy is my biggest problem. And then the argument people have on the street is they say, look, we don't care about social distancing. We don't want to be at home. We would rather die having COVID than die of hunger. So that is a choice facing a lot of Africans. Mm-hmm. How do you choose to die? You're going to die anyway. And we're going to die anyway. We'd rather go to work, feed our children, then die, than sit at home hungry and die. So it's not just a medical problem. It's an economic problem. It's a financial problem. And we need help. And I hope Western nations can make some help available. And we're not just looking for aid. Find a mechanized way for agriculture so we can grow more products, we can feed our people, enough subsistence level of agriculture. Many things we could do with the West and not be so dependent on China. And that would help us. I don't want to, we have very little time here, but we need help from the West and to work with Nigerian leaders and African leaders, like the ambassador said, and we can turn this around. But the economy is as important as health right now.
Thank you, Senator. It's interesting that you mentioned in terms of the interconnectedness, really, the global interconnectedness. I think this COVID-19 crisis has really shown how connected we are, even though I think more and more so, we realize that we also need to depend on our own manufacturing and our own economy. However, at the same time, you can't deny the fact that our interconnectedness is making us both strong and yet at the same time vulnerable, which leads me to the question, Mr. Grant, I was wondering whether you can share a bit more about your perspective, given your work during the Obama administration, specifically pertaining to Africa. How do you think the U.S. present efforts in engaging with the continent, specifically with the COVID-19, but overall, as the Senator was mentioning, the economic side of things, how is the engagement process looking like, Mr. Harris, and how do we move forward?
Thank you for having me. It's an excellent question. I think the ambassador and the senator have made great points in providing the context about how this is both a health crisis, but also an economic crisis, and it is affecting countries on every level. I had the honor of serving in the White House from 2011 to 2015 as President Obama's special assistant and senior director for Africa. So I was the senior most advisor on Africa to him, and responsible for U.S.-Africa policy. That coincided as well with the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And there were moments, particularly at the beginning of that epidemic, where we were looking at the modeling, and one model showed that there could be 1.3 million new infections within a 4-month period, and that it would increase exponentially if you didn't bend the curve. And what we saw then was U.S. leadership and President Obama rallying other countries to support those afflicted nations and try to figure out what measures could be taken and what assistance could be provided. We saw that also previously in combating the HIV/AIDS epidemic when President Bush rallied others and made a major U.S. investment in the form of PEPFAR and the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, which has now been credited with saving over 18 million lives to date. So I think the context of U.S. leadership and looking to work with others to combat a disease is something that we're not seeing today. It's much different. The circumstances of the pandemic and affecting countries at the same time and being so global is definitely an issue, but I think many countries and leaders are looking inward rather than looking to cooperate on some of what the shared solutions might be. And to the senator's point and to the ambassador's point, what a lot of these shared solutions include is with respect to African states, helping provide liquidity in economies, helping free up resources to be put towards stabilizing healthcare systems, helping create safety nets, and alleviating the tens of millions of individuals that are at risk of slipping back into or deeper into poverty because of making that gut-wrenching decision of whether to try to socially distance to the extent it's even possible in many urban slum and other environments, or to go out and to make money and put food on the table. These conversations are happening a bit with respect to debt relief, and the G20 has taken some actions, but I think we are desperate to see more leadership on a global scale, the US in particular, in combating this disease.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I want to actually touch on a couple of things a bit later, if we have time, about what you mentioned about Ebola and AIDS, HIV/AIDS, because I think that has given some context in terms of how the healthcare system has been developed throughout Africa. But before we get to that, I want to address another set of issues that was also brought up, especially when it comes to the economy and kind of the global connectivity. It's well known that Africa has been exploited by corporations and countries for centuries, for its labor, for its resources. And at this point, as we're seeing, you know, as the ambassador and the senator was mentioning, the fact that the economic damage of coronavirus is so severe that people have to choose between death by disease or death by hunger. What is your perspective in terms of how the global engagement needs to happen in order for us to correct these issues? What are the responsibility of corporations? Because obviously the world's benefiting from, you know, for example, microchips that are helping with all the computer systems that are around. A lot of the minerals and materials are mined and coming from the African continent. How do we basically create a better system for this global economy to function in the future? Ambassador, perhaps we can start with your thoughts.
You know, that is an issue that lately I'm speaking to more and more. Let's start with World Bank and IMF. The average country, African country, is spending a third of their GDP on loan repayment. Some of these loans in some countries go back to colonization. They continue to get loans with very high interest rates, intentionally done in order to keep Africa where they feel Africa should be. You know, France can borrow money from the World Bank for 1%, and Ghana will borrow the same amount of money for 15% interest rate. Those are blatant wrongs that have been committed, and they've been committed for centuries. That has got to, it is my humble opinion that you know, all African countries, and that's a bit aggressive, but it is the truth. I think all African countries should stop paying back all the loans that they've been given by World Bank and IMF, because in my humble opinion, those loans have been paid over a gazillion times. So yes, debt relief through forgiveness of these loans is in order, and it is timely. Let's look at corporations. The corporations that go back, the majority of them, to colonization. When African countries were given their independence during between the 50s and 60s, we were given limited political independence, but zero economic liberation. Those companies that were doing business in those African countries prior to independence, they continued to do business in those countries. The majority of those companies that go back to colonization, they control 75, sometimes more than 75% of the economy, because they are major employers. You look at the former French colonies, there's even a pact that they were forced to sign as they were emerging and quote unquote being liberated from France. I don't know if some of you know about that pact, the pact for the continuation of colonization. You think they would have given it a different name, but that's what they called it. On one hand, we want you to be independent, but on the other hand, you got to sign this document to agree to continue to be colonized. What this document basically said, you have to give up 85% of your bank reserves and deposit them with France, and France will take those funds, pull them together, and invest them in their French stock market under the French name, and those countries may or may not know the returns. And that also, should you wish to access some of your money, because you give 85% of your reserves, you're only left with 15. You have to submit your country's financial report, and if approved, you can only access 20% of your deposit the previous year. whatever you deposited prior to that, you'll never get it back. And you get that, that amount as a loan at commercial interest rate. So now it's your own money that you're borrowing and you get it now as a loan. That has been going on for 60 years up until 3 weeks ago, when France finally ratified a law that's now going to say African countries no longer, the former French colonies, no longer need to deposit their bank reserves with France. The only difference is that amount had gone down to about 50 to 60%. But in this day and age, because of that Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, France was taking out of Africa over $500 billion every year. $500 billion taken out of poor African countries every year. Can you imagine how many schools, how many hospitals, how many jobs could be created with $500 billion every year? Nobody was talking about it. The world was not talking about it. All they were doing was jumping up and down about, oh, corruption in Africa. Okay, fine. The corruption watchdog says 50 billion comes out of Africa from corruption every year. 50 billion, the whole continent. That's a lot of money. Yes, we must go after it. But at the same time, you don't want us to talk about the 500 billion going to France every year. Nobody was talking about that. So they want us to focus on the 50 billion so we never have to talk about the 500 billion. That's just France. They also said in that pact, all the contracts, private and public, French companies have the first right of refusal. Up until now, French companies still have first right of refusal. That was the biggest complaint I had from American companies. They were saying, Ambassador, it's next to impossible for American companies to win a bid in the former African French colonies. It's because of that pact. The leaders, because of that pact, cannot do anything without permission from France. They're totally controlled. And because of, and also France has military presence in each country. And the countries, if in the event of war, they can only align with France. Their military can only be trained by France. They can only buy military equipment from France. And they cannot have military alliance with their neighbors. Total control. So now you've given up your, and also the natural resources. French companies have the first right of refusal. So if you've given up your finances, you've given up your military, you've given up your finances, military, and your natural resources. What do you have left as a leader? What are you leading? And the world sits back and say, Africa, how come you're not making it? First of all, we're little bitty economies that are not supposed to even be on their own. How does Gabon, 1.4 million people, compete with China with 1.4 billion people? This is insanity of the highest order. Berlin Conference left Africa. I don't even know how in 2020 we're still accepting such sheer stupidity. There's no parity here. It's infuriating the more you begin to think about it. Yeah. How does Togo go to the world stage and negotiate with the United States, and you call that parity? Togo should be negotiating with Delaware, the state of Delaware. Nigeria should be negotiating with the state of Texas. But the world says, no. You're all countries. You have the same sovereignty on the world stage. It was all done so the Africans can continuously be beat up on the world stage in terms of trading. The unfair trade policies, the residual companies, multinationals that remain from colonization, they continue to siphon money out of Africa through the safe havens. The majority of them don't pay taxes. And when countries try to say you must pay taxes, there are consequences. I know many, after they have been pushed to say you've got to start paying taxes, then they just close shop and they move on to the next country to start the same thing again. And when they do that, thousands end up unemployed. So it's a very difficult thread to, a very difficult needle to thread for leaders in trying to do what is right for their people, but at the same time, maintain the economic balance. Our people don't have the financial resources to own these multinational corporations. The multinational corporations have got to start treating Africa fairly. The safe havens must stop. If Jane Doe on the street is paying taxes, the multinational corporations must also pay taxes. They must stop getting involved in illegal mining, illegal fishing, illegal trade in wildlife and plants. The abuse is endless. The abuse is endless. You fly over the DRC, you'll see tarmacs in the middle of the jungles. Planes are flying right into the DRC, picking up minerals. And these poor Africans are making a living digging for these minerals by hands. And all of them are dying young from asthma and all kinds of respiratory diseases because of what they're doing to make a little bit of money. It is insanity of the highest order. And then you look at what comes out of that is the corruption that follows, the guns that are put into those countries, wherever they find with their satellites. They know where the diamond reserves are. They know where the coltan reserves are. So what do? They pay a few Africans and give them ammunition, rifles to go kill the villagers. Kill a few so they all run away so they can stay behind and continue their illegal mining. The multinationals, they are making the fight to free Africa mission impossible. So at every level, Africa is under siege.
Yeah.
And the only way, the only hope for Africa to really come out of this doldrum is for Africa to speak with one voice. But also the multinationals and the former colonizers, they are doing a great job of making sure that we don't unite. You take, for example, after the issue with George Floyd, the African heads of states had come together and they were going to send a petition to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And somehow, suddenly, they backed off. Why did they back off? I can tell you, I'm pretty sure there were some phone calls made and there were some threats made, and that's why they backed off. So it's really, really difficult to try and understand and appreciate what is going on in Africa. It is terrible that the world continues to treat Africa in this manner. The exploitation and the abuse, to what end? It has to stop. You know, Africa is a huge continent. We have enough resources to take care of the entire world. We're simply asking that the world treats Africa fairly. Stop exploiting Africa. Stop treating Africans like they're subhumans. Stop treating Africa just as your equal. And let's level the playing field. There's no way Togo could be put in a position to trade with China. That is just not right. It's like taking you, my son, and throwing you in the same boxing ring with Muhammad Ali. And when you can't win, you can't even throw the first punch. The world says, well, what's wrong with you? You could fight Muhammad Ali? You know, it's this insanity that is going on in this world when it comes to Africa, the double standards. And then, of course, I take it back to us because we don't question it either. We don't question it either. We don't challenge it. We don't get in the face and say, stop it. The 500 billion from France, that one is totally mind-boggling. How for over 60 years, we have been bullied. We have been bullied into giving up that kind of money. Right now, according to the African Union, Africa needs $100 billion a year for the next 10 years to completely build out the African infrastructure. That's only 2 years of takings from France. And they call us poor. They call us poor. No, they want us to continue chasing our tails so they can get away with the exploitation. So when it's all said and done, I put the ball right back in our hands. Because as Africans, we must unite, we must come together, we must speak with one voice, and that is the only way we'll be able to stand up to these bullies and say enough is enough, stop it.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that. I want to get another perspective in terms of what the ambassador was saying about speaking with one voice, and from a country perspective, from Nigeria. Senator, can you talk a little bit about how, to the ambassador's point, that African countries should really define their strategic interests? Looking ahead, what can groups, economic development organizations working on international trade, how can they be supportive to this effort to, one, expose the inequity in this entire system that's creating this really untenable situation where Africa can't move forward, to the ambassador's point, in terms of having a fair chance of actually competing on the world stage. From a Nigerian perspective, how do you think that economic development agencies and international players can support that development to help elevate individual countries and the African continent as a whole?
First of all, I agree with the ambassador. I never met her before, but she's a freedom fighter, and I'm a big fan of you. I don't know what country you're from, but I'm one of your biggest fans right now. Well, first of all, I believe, when I was in the Senate, I believe Africa should be a country, not 51, 52 countries. We're too small to be independent state. We're too small. And some of these countries are local governments by themselves compared to Nigeria. And Nigeria is what, a quarter of the population of Africa. You know, Africa should be like the Kwame and Nkrumah tribe. Africa should be one country, one foreign policy, one manufacturing base. Okay, let's focus on the economy. Let's just focus on the economy. let's focus on electric cars. Let's focus on green energy. Let's focus. The sun is, we're at the equator, Nigeria, for instance. The sun is free. But in the Senate, I try to pass a bill to make sure we convert, we stop importing electric cars by 2025, and I was defeated. Another bill I tried to pass on the floor of the Senate was for any Nigerian with any American or anybody in the Caribbean with African blood should be able to come back and get 2 passports. Now, my reason for saying so is as follows. Now, the Chinese are not related to Africans. The Europeans are not related to Africans. The only relatives we have are African Americans in America and the Caribbean or Brazil and so on and so forth. If you look at, in 1984, when Jesse Jackson was running for office, he said to me in 1984 that if Black America was a country, it would be the 10th largest economy in the world. Now, if Black America, I'm sure the economy is worth over $1 trillion today. If African Americans and Africans can come together with the talent they have, with the great education, come together, work together, we can develop Africa overnight, and they have a right to come back and develop Africa. The ambassador is right. We have been colonized. We've been exploited by those who colonize us. And think about it, ambassador. You can't expect them not to exploit us. That is what they want. They want to exploit us. It's for us to resist this. So we have 2 problems. The man exploiting us doesn't have any love for us. He wants your resources. We have a responsibility to make sure smart, intelligent leaders are elected into public office like ambassador here, who care about their country and not care about their pockets. It goes both ways. It's like the argument of, okay, who is to blame when dope is being sold in America? Do you blame Americans for buying dope, or you blame the Mexicans for supplying dope? That's the argument, okay? Now, the fault goes both ways. Those who exploit us must stop, and African leaders must stop the exploitation themselves. And I think a natural unity should be with Africans and African Americans. They have the economic base to come work with us to transform Africa. By now, African nations should have developed an electric car for Africa. 1.2 billion people. What's difficult? First of all, South Africa has a manufacturing base. You go to a beautiful country like Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, and so it's beautiful African countries. We can work together, develop tourism. We can work together to mine our own products. We don't have to take our diamond to Brussels to cut them into gemstone. We have gold, we have cocoa. We can convert to chocolate. We can start manufacturing a chocolate, Nestle, Cadbury, and so on and so forth. I focus on the economy because look, if you are rich, nobody criticizes you, nobody fights you. It's only when you are poor they think you're stupid. If you make a lot of money, no white man looks at Michael Jordan and thinks he's a black guy. Nobody looks at Shaquille O'Neal and thinks he's a black guy because they're rich. But if you see a guy pushing a truck, he's poor. All of a sudden, he's inferior. But if he has any money, he's okay. So first of all, Africa themselves must unite. Africans themselves, the AU, we must come together, what Gaddafi said, try to form a country out of Africa and be united and forget about these borders and all these currencies we have that don't make any sense. We must break our ties with colonial masters. And the biggest problem we have in Africa today is China. We are no longer colonized by the British, the French, the Belgians. We're now being colonized by the Chinese, right? So I blame our leaders for that. But then again, what is America doing about it? What is Britain doing about it? What is Germany doing about it? They've allowed us to now be colonized by the Chinese. Soon China, for us to be free from Europe, we will now be colonized by China. And that is happening very, very fast across Africa, including Nigeria. And Ambassador, this must stop. And you're a brilliant woman. I like your argument. I can't fault anything you've said. And I really wish African leaders could be as passionate, as compassionate, and smart and intelligent like you, speak with passion and care about the continent. Unfortunately, Ambassador, a lot of our leaders don't care about the people they lead. That is the biggest problem. We need to address that. They don't care about the people they lead. They're not conscious, so they do deals with people to exploit us. When you look at Congo, why would Congo, the size of Western Europe, be in such disarray? How is that humanly possible? So you're right. I can argue with you, but we need for us to succeed, for us to make any progress. African leaders first must come together, try to form a country of the continent, and then we can negotiate with North America, United States, Europe, China, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Senator. You mentioned a lot about kind of the influence from international. Both Ambassador and the Senator have mentioned this as well. And there's been a couple mentions in terms of Chinese investments influence over the continent as well. Mr. Harris, if you can share a bit of your perspective on that as well, given the outside investment from around the world into Africa, and some look at it as investment and some look at it as exploitation. And as both Senator and Ambassador are saying, this is having a very devastating effect on the African continent and the local economies there. In the United States, we also have, the Senator was mentioning, what is the United States doing about it? Can you share a bit of the perspective in terms of, from the United States, what is that perspective in terms of the various investments that are going into Africa, especially when in relations to, for example, the United States policies like AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act? How is it that we're correcting these situations, and can we be helpful in this conversation? Mr. Harris?
That's, again, a great set of questions. Right now, there are a lot of countries and economic regions that are taking an intense interest in African economic growth, and Africa's been home to some of the fastest growing economies in the world in previous years. China has been at the top of that list. They've become Africa's largest trading partner since 2009, and their foreign direct investment has been increasing exponentially, as has their lending to African governments as well. And for many African governments, they owe some 30 to 40% of their external debt to China. And that is a real factor in terms of having influence and it being unclear as well what sort of collateral and other things underpin those loans. But I think the relationship between China and African states is multifaceted, and it's important to understand that. It is commercial in many ways, and there is a lot of investment, as I said. There's an estimated 10,000 Chinese companies operating on the continent, according to McKinsey. And China is making $50 billion a year just off of its infrastructure investments, and that's a lot of jobs that are flowing to Beijing as well. But it's not just commercial and economic. China also has opened up Confucius Institutes and is focusing on cultural ties. There are more African students studying in China now than there are in the United States or the United Kingdom. And Africa has also invested in media and in expanding its state-controlled media enterprises into the African continent as well. And so it is a very widespread and I would say multifaceted approach they're taking. It's not just China. Other countries are also seeing that there's huge economic opportunity. I think it's very important to distinguish in terms of the types of investment and the ends of those investment, because African states clearly need capital. As the ambassador noted, the African Development Bank estimates that it's between somewhere around $87 to $112 billion annually that is an infrastructure gap, that is money needed to invest in infrastructure across the continent. And this lack of infrastructure shaves off at least 2% of GDP of African states, according to many estimates. So Africa needs capital. It's got to be private sector investment. Public sector spending will never be enough, I think, to close that gap. But the issue is that it needs to be done in a transparent manner. It needs to be invested in a manner that is supporting strong institutions and good governance. It needs to be in a way that African citizens know what is on the hook when African governments are taking these types of loans, and that it's not strategic infrastructure or assets or other things that are all decided behind closed doors or in smoky rooms. And so I would say that private sector spending is massively needed, and African states are smart to try to attract this capital, but the capital that comes in really needs to be spent wisely, and it needs to be invested in a way that doesn't corrode democratic institutions. Right now, to your question about the United States, unfortunately, the Trump administration is really representing somewhat of a break in terms of how it's talking about Africa and talking about what's going on. And the US strategy at the moment casts Africa really much more as a pawn in a great power game between China, something to compete over, as if African states and African citizens don't have agency or don't, that there's no inherent need or interest for the US to engage in the continent except to compete with China. I think that's a severe mistake. I think that President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama were much more effective in shifting policy towards trade and investment and seeking greater parity in relations. And I think there's a lot more work to be done along all those areas. But I think right now the US is moving somewhat in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I think we're addressing a lot of heavy issues, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of time to dig even deeper in it. I do want to pivot a little bit as well. Given the African continents, the growing and relatively young population of about 40% of the population is below the age of 15. And what we're seeing in the United States is this huge movement from the Zoomers, Gen Z, are really shaping the future in a different direction. From your perspective, what do you think this new generation, the younger generation, is hoping to see and hoping to change in the future? And would love to get all three perspectives, and then we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. Ambassador, can we start with you, please?
I see an Africa that is very vibrant, with its youth who are ready to engage and who are beginning to understand. When you start looking and following social media, the African youth are beginning to understand the real issues, not superficially. They understand where the real issues are. Now they know clearly that singularly, France is the biggest risk to peace and security and economic development in Africa. Let me put things in perspective for you. If you look at all the countries in the world that are having instability issues, the conflict areas, majority are in Africa. 40% of them are in Africa. 19 countries to be exact. And then when you zoom into Africa and say, of the 19 countries, who are they? 17 of them are former French colonies. So all the conflict zones in Africa are happening in the former French colonies. Now, the latest, we have data that shows that during the day, France is supporting the government, and at night, they're supporting the terrorists or the rebels, all intended to keep us in conflict. As long as we're in conflict, they're getting away with what they want. And so our African youth are beginning to understand that. So there have been demonstrations in French embassies. Messages are going to say, France, your stronghold on Africa, you cannot, it's not sustainable anymore. So the youth are engaging in the proper conversations, and they are taking their fights to the right front. We need to support them, because before they weren't quite understanding what was happening. They were fighting the war, but at the wrong front. Yes, we have leadership issues, but I have to look at it and say, we look at it from a global point of view. Just removing a leader alone without addressing the environment, you can't accomplish anything. So yes, we need to deal with leadership issues, but we also deal with the other peripheral issues, which are really in reality the root cause of why Africa is where Africa is today. But in spite of all that, you are seeing so many innovations coming out of Africa. You have young youth who are, with one young youth in Nigeria, I think he invented a helicopter, and he's looking at having what you call it, Uber, a helicopter Uber. I don't know when that's going to be implemented, but it was just so creative, trying to deal with the congestion traffic issues in Lagos. We have young youth, they are developing mobile apps, they are involved in artificial intelligence. You know, by 2030, over 50% of Africa is going to be online. Like Bruce said, in 2019, 6 of the fastest growing economies were in Africa. I see an Africa that is vibrant. There's so much, of course, Africans have invented electric cars. It's a fascinating time to think that these young people can be so inventive with very little.
Yes.
Can you imagine if they had everything they needed to really bring out the best that they can? Yes. So yes, we have an amazing continent, and in spite of the limitations, the African youth are really charging the way forward. That's why some of us elders, We feel more energized when we see them doing the best they can under very difficult circumstances. We have got to step back and say, you know what, babe, I got your back. I got your back. With your energy and your intelligence and a little bit of wisdom that we have, together, we can do this. And those who set out to exploit us, together, we can defeat them. And I can tell you one thing, we will defeat them. We will defeat them. Contrary to what they think, we will defeat them. By the way, Senator, I'm from Zimbabwe. Some say you're
Zimbabwe, okay.
There's no two ways about it. Their days are numbered and they need to know it. Their days are numbered. The sooner they come to the table and begin to treat Africa fairly, the better off the colonizers are going to be. Now, colonizers have not left. We have only ignored the colonizers. Like one ambassador told me one time, he said, Ambassador, here's how he looks at the Chinese and the colonizers. He said, growing up in our village, there are animals that always live around the village. So he said, the Chinese are like the hyena. The hyena will come in, will eat some of the crops, but the hyena will always leave some of the crops because the hyena knows there are other people who gotta eat too. Those are the Chinese. They'll bring 50 billion, they take out 30 billion. The colonizers, on the other hand, they storm into the village, they're like a lion. They eat everything, they take what they can. What they cannot, they destroy. That's the difference. But the bottom line is, we got two thieves in our village. We have an old thief and a new thief. What platform is the old thief standing on to warn us about the new thief? You're afraid of the competition? You're afraid of the new kid on the block? They are both thieves. We must understand them for who they are, except the old thief is so deep-rooted. His roots are so deep. Try getting France out of Africa. It's mission impossible. We can get China out of Africa. Mission impossible getting France out of Africa. So let's understand our issues for what they are. We have two thieves, a new thief and an old thief, and they both must get out of our village.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that. Senator, your thoughts on the youth and the future and what their hope is and what their thoughts are.
Well, let me say, Ms. Zimbabwe, I'm in love with you already. So let me say this. We have 1.3 billion people, right? You have to understand Africa. And she talks about France all the time. You know, it's so funny. When she was talking, I was thinking, the entire French national team that won the World Cup were all Africans. There's not a single white guy on the French national team, okay? And you have to understand Africa in the context, let them put it in the context of sports, so you can understand opportunity. Take Hakeem Olajuwon, rated one of the 50 greatest basketball players in the world, right? He was a soccer player in Nigeria. They brought him to America, and he was interviewed on TV one day. And he said, now you're in America. Tell me the greatest event or what happened in America that makes you love America so much. And he could barely speak English with an American accent. Then he said, when I was in Lagos, my shoes were size 13. In America, I can now wear size 17 shoes. Imagine what he went through, size 13 to size 17, okay, for shoes. Let me give you another example so you understand the potential of Africa. There's a guy called Dick Tiger. Dick Tiger was the first man to be middleweight and light heavyweight champion of the world in 66 and 67. What happened was the British Empire champion was traveling across Africa. He went to the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. He went to Freetown, now Sierra Leone. He said, I will pay you 3 guineas. 3 guineas then, before independence, was 3 pounds and 3 shillings. If you can last 3 rounds with me, I will give you 3 guineas. So he went to Sierra Leone, knocked out everybody, went to Ghana, knocked out everybody, came to Lagos. He said, now, can anybody jump in the ring with me? I will give you 3 guineas. This skinny little kid got in the ring and knocked out the British world champion. He then turned out to be the first black man to be middleweight and light heavyweight champion of the world. The point I'm making is this. We are a diamond in the rough, but we don't have the same opportunity as you. If Nigeria had 10% of the opportunity as a British or a Chinese or an American, we would win every single gold medal, without a doubt. There's no doubt about it. So sometimes I begin to wonder, do the rest of the world want to leave us in abject poverty, or do they want to give us a helping hand? Now, listening to the ambassador, it makes sense for them not to give us a helping hand. So if an African does well, he goes to Europe, he becomes German or French or British. If he comes to America, he becomes an American. So So you call it brain drain, brain drain for us and brain gain for you.
Yeah.
So yes, you take the most brilliant Africans and you turn them into your citizens, and you brainwash them. They become your citizens, then they don't go back home, and that's what needs to stop. Now the question is, listen to the ambassador: is the American going to stop it? Is the British country government going to stop it? Is the German government going to stop it? Or are we going to stop it? But how can we stop it if they don't have the opportunity? They have a right to become. Look, 70% of all Black doctors in America are Nigerians. We have Nigerians all over the world doing very well. Your opportunities are greater in your country, but not as great in Africa. I was in Zimbabwe in '86 with Jesse Jackson. And let me tell you, the first time I went to Zimbabwe, when I went to Harare, I thought I was in London. I swear to God, it was so beautiful. I haven't been there since. It was amazing. The same way I felt when I went to Cote d'Ivoire, when I went to Dakar, I went to Johannesburg. We have everything in Africa, but something is missing. The question is, are we going to help ourselves, and can we fix the problems ourselves? Do we need the West to help us? The question is, will they help us, or are we going to have this conversation with when we're all dead and our kids and our grandkids are going to take over? I don't know. I don't have the answer to the question. I guess we can all ask the questions. I don't have the answer. Do we fight? But one thing I do know, Africa population is growing very fast. We need to slow it down. We're growing too fast. We're growing too fast. There are not enough resources to feed the kids we're producing. I think 1.3 billion people in Africa, we're growing too fast. Now, you may disagree with the China policy of one child per family, but I don't think the numbers is what makes you a great economy. Israel don't have the numbers, but they're great. When I was university in America, my professor said to me, he said, are the Jews the chosen people? And we had a debate in the classroom, Iowa State University. Some people said yes, some people said no. Then the professor said, well, the average Jewish family has 1.7 kids, and the minimum education for a Jewish family it's a master's degree. So they have greater education, more resources towards the kids, and they become more successful. Now, we having 10 kids per family, 20 kids per family, I don't know if that's a good idea, but whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, religion then takes over. Poor people are usually very, very religious. Rich people don't go to church and don't go to the mosque, but poor people do that. I want what's best for Africa. I will do whatever it takes to help my country and to help other African countries. It's tough for all of us, but I'm only hoping that the multinational corporations, Western governments, the Chinese government, those countries exploiting Africa today will say, hey, they've had enough, they've made enough money, let them give us a helping hand.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Harris, your thoughts on the youth of Africa and the future?
It's a blessing and a burden to go third when the ambassador and the senator are my co-panelists here. They both made excellent points. I think picking up on what the senator was mentioning, the demographics are really important to understand, especially for an audience that is mainly American, as we have on this call today. By 2050, Africa is going to be 1/4 of the world's population. And given how young the African population is, by 2050, Africa will be 1/4 of the world's workforce in terms of working age. And if you think about where economic growth can come from, and if you think about economic potential, and as the ambassador mentioned when alluding to how Africa could really be the breadbasket of the world, 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. These are resources in human capital, and not just natural resources, that the rest of the world really needs to pay attention to. It's going to dramatically impact economic trends and political trends. And as the African Union and as African states are increasingly collective in their voice and regionally integrating, these trends are really going to be important for not just the US audience, but for any audience that's trying to understand what's going to be happening in this world over the coming decades. I think when it comes to youth, one thing that I'm very proud of my involvement in launching the Young African Leaders Initiative in the White House under President Obama, and it gave me an opportunity to talk with thousands of young leaders on the continent, particularly entrepreneurs, but also civic leaders. And the issues that I kept hearing time and again were really bread and butter issues. Job creation. A young population is going to need 37 million or so jobs each year created, according to the IMF. And that was pre-COVID. That was before the economic devastation that we're facing right now in terms of the pandemic. Access to capital. The ambassador has mentioned a lot of incredible entrepreneurs. There are over 500 hubs and incubators on the continent now, but entrepreneurs can only do so much if they don't have the money and the investment. And that's another type of systemic problem and access to capital issue that really needs to be combated to give African entrepreneurs the opportunities that they deserve to create these businesses and help them thrive. I think also civic freedom and being included in these political processes. As the senator mentioned, there are issues across the continent where leadership is incredibly uneven in terms of the democratic growth that we're seeing. And some political processes aren't as welcoming or as they should be to young voices to really feel included. There are certain political parties and systems that are quite entrenched in not providing the inclusive space. I say this is a challenge that the governments around the world are facing. I'm just trying to apply this to the types of things that I hear a lot about in talking to African youth and what I think will be really important in providing the economic opportunities and the inclusive, sustainable economic growth that is going to make all the difference, not just in getting past this pandemic, but making sure that this massive potential of the continent of these many states over the coming decades is really felt. As the senator was mentioning too and alluding to, if you don't create jobs and yet you have a young population that is disaffected, that can be a recipe for instability. These policy challenges are quite real in demanding leadership and in demanding the type of economic governance and political leadership that is going to create opportunities for this young population.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And to the audience members, this is our 10th session together with the World Affairs Council and the World Trade Center. And in the past 9th session, you know that we actually spend quite a lot of time on the audience discussion part. However, I have to apologize in advance. This conversation has been so fascinating that I'm dominating the question. I haven't been given our audience a lot of time to ask a question. So at this point, I want to pass it back to Jessica from the World Affairs Council to see whether there are any, maybe a couple questions we can squeeze in. Jessica?
Thank you so much. Yes, we did get quite a few questions, but this has been a fascinating conversation. I know we're almost out of time, so if you can keep your answers short, that would be helpful, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Ambassador, what African unification model is being proposed, and what's the timeline to set up to accomplish this?
First one has to do with trade, through the decision that was approved by the heads of states in April of 2018. Ratification was in July. The official launch was July of last year, and implementation is going to be this January. It has been moved for 6 months. So the African Continental Free Trade Area, it is the absolute biggest event, most significant event that has taken place over the continent. The African Continental Free Trade Area is going to see all the 54 African countries go to the world market as one customs union. That is huge. That means Togo, Djibouti, Malawi, Equatorial Guinea, they no longer have to go to the world market as little bitty boxers trying to fight the heavyweights. So Africa coming together and speaking with one voice and going to the world stage as one big heavyweight, it's actually going to be bigger than Muhammad Ali. So that is the biggest thing that has ever happened to the continent. So we hope that everybody can come together and make sure that this amazing decision, which is really the savior for the continent, is a resounding success.
Thank you so much. Senator, how does Africa train, develop, and support leaders who put their people first?
That is a big problem. You know, after colonization, and this is very sad for me, leaders who took over African countries basically got there imitating the leaders who ran Africa. In other words, this is very sad, and I'm going to upset the ambassador now. So you had the British, the German, the Belgians ruling Africa. These Africans who took over at independence, all they did was imitate the white people who colonized the black people. So a lot of our leaders don't think African. They think exploitation. And the people who vote for them are the Africans, the leaders are Europeans. That's the only way I can explain it. Now, When this generation leaves, when they all leave, then hopefully we can get some freedom fighters like the ambassador who can think Africa. You see, the minimum qualification to run for office may be a high school diploma, a university degree. I always ask this question: which university teaches you compassion? If you don't have compassion for the poor, and you don't build hospitals for the poor, but when you as a leader get sick, you go to Paris to get well. And then when there's a disease in Africa, all of a sudden we don't have a health infrastructure. You send your kids to go to school at Harvard or Yale or MIT or Oxford, and you don't spend the resources on educational system for Africa, then they pay the price. And so while I agree we've been exploited, some of the biggest culprits are African leaders who don't care about the people they govern in the first place.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you. Grant, what is the best way to sustainably and equitably mine for resources in Africa?
That's a tough question as well, though I suppose rather easy too. I think the best way, and the ambassador was really getting at this earlier in some of her initial comments, it's how the multinational corporations, particularly in this space, are treating the countries in which they operate. There are a lot of international initiatives like the Extractive and Transparency Initiative, EITI, that is trying to create a code of conduct and is trying to encourage best practices in doing this. But I don't think there's any secret thought. I think any company that's doing business anywhere, whether domestically or abroad, should hold themselves up to the highest standards, should think about the social and environmental consequences of their work, should think about developing labor and transferring technology, and should think about how they can be constructive players in the communities in which they work. And so I think mining, there are a lot of unfortunate, terrible stories that the ambassador also was mentioning too, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere. And I think ensuring that companies are following the laws, that the laws are clear, that they're enforced, and that you attack it not just in terms of the expectations put on the companies, which should be there and should be fair, but also in holding leaders to account to operate in transparent manners and have political systems that require that as well.
Thank you. Ambassador, I'll direct this one to you. The questioner says, I've been in global supply chains for 35 years and following production shift out of Japan in the late 1980s, out of Taiwan and Korea in the 1990s, and shifting now from China to South Asia and Southeast Asia. Many of my peers are seeing today's shift already starting to the Horn of Africa. Don't these create jobs and improve the local economies in Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia?
I think they will, but what is really needed is for us to add value addition to our natural resources. That is singularly the biggest problem. Africa is creating millions of jobs for other nations through just exploitation of our natural resources without value addition. So yes, that helps, but it's not enough. When you look at it, again, going back to unfair trade policies, we are the largest producers of tea and coffee out of the Horn of Africa. Our farmers are being paid pennies to the dollar. The coffee ends up in Europe, it gets relabeled. Before you know it, we're buying it back in Africa as Swiss coffee, Swiss chocolate. That has to stop. That has to stop. The trade policies were making it very difficult for our farmers to add value, or countries to add value to our natural resources, because you add the natural resources, the tariffs that are slapped on that value-added product, it's not even worth for you to continue. Same is happening, for example, if you take cocoa, the largest producer, 65% of cocoa comes from West Africa. For years, Africa, the West African countries were deterred from having to add value to the cocoa, and yet West African cocoa built the city of Cadbury in the UK. West African cocoa beans built the city of Hershey in Pennsylvania. Then one wonders, where is the city built out of chocolate in West Africa? All they do is just take our raw materials and create jobs for themselves. So if we can just begin to add value to our own, but more importantly, we don't need to export our hot chocolate. We don't need to export our chocolates. We have 1.3 billion people to sell chocolates to. We have 1.2 billion people. Why should I eat instant Rico coffee from Switzerland when I know it came from Ethiopia? It's insanity of the highest order. So, like I said, we need to add value to our own. We need to begin to look from inside. And the trade policies, the unfair trade policies, have got to cease, which is why I hope that the African Continental Free Trade Area is going to be a game changer. And yes, For those who are coming in and shifting their manufacturing to the Horn of Africa, we thank you. But that's only a dent. It's 1.3 billion people. A lot more is needed, and we are capable. We are capable of making that change. We must look inward, and I'm hoping the African Continental Free Trade Area is going to do that. Also, when the African Continental Free Trade Area is implemented, 90% of the goods that are going to be traded within Africa are going to be duty-free. So in the next 4 to 5 years, we're expecting intra-Africa trade to quadruple. That's really going to be huge in terms of job creation and also value addition. But that starts with what the senator was saying. It starts with the right mindset. The mindset that says, I'm just as good as the white man. I'm just as intelligent as the white man. That what the lies the white man has been telling me all along, I don't believe them anymore because I now can see clearly. So the mind, the healing that we need, the unshackling of our minds in order for us to successfully implement the African Continental Free Trade Area, in order to successfully look inward and believe in ourselves, we must have a serious conversation, each and every one of us, with the image in the mirror.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we've gone a bit late, but thank all of you for this really enlightening discussion. Stephen?
Thank you, Jessica. And I want to thank the panelists again for taking time to share with us their thoughts. It's been fascinating for us, I'm sure for the audience member as well, as a nation over the last few weeks have been really a lot of us have been holding a mirror up to ourselves to see basically what have we done in the United States to basically get to this point where a big population are now no longer wanting or able to turn a blind eye to the injustices that have been done in this country, built on the backs of the people of color in this nation. And I think as we're discussing in this conversation is reflecting a bigger issue that's been happening internationally, but the target has been unfairly treating the African nation in a way based on old colonial policies, and it's now really exacerbated in many ways by COVID-19 and by some of the various issues that are facing all of us together. So I want to thank you again for sharing your thoughts and helping us to really hold a bigger mirror to look at what we are as an international player, both in Los Angeles and the United States, and what our responsibility should be to make sure that we help the world and help other folks get to the right mindset of creating fair trade policies and fair policies that can help advance us all. And what I hope with this conversation and many conversations down the line, the United States, Angelenos, and people around will have that right mindset of what the ambassador said, that we can go to Africa and we can say, we got your back. I think it's time for us to basically do the right thing. And I think this conversation has definitely enlightened my perspective. I'm hoping that we're going to be working very closely with you all in the future to make sure that we have a thriving economy for all of the nations, and especially the African continents that, as the speakers today have said, have faced so much injustices. With that said, I want to thank again Ambassador Chihombori Quao, Mr. Murray Bruce, and also Mr. Harris for your time and for your contribution, and more importantly, for your ongoing work. This is really challenging work, and to hear your passion, to hear your knowledge, to hear your insights, and to hear your wisdom is really inspirational, not only for the audience here, but I'm sure for the youth of the future. So thank you again. I want to pass it back to our host, Kim. Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, as Stephen said, for a very, very important and informative discussion. I appreciate all of your time so very much. We're more knowledgeable and informed today because of this discussion, so thank you. To our audience, please go to our website at lawac.org and find out all of our upcoming programs and register, make a donation, become a member. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.